just wanted to
I always get so frantic.
Can you pass me the water?
You want the cold one?
Fine, yeah. Thank you.
We got waters up here. Hey everybody, welcome to Parlor House Museum. I'm Chris Rogers. This is more logistics than a real introduction right now. And just to let you all know, so we're going to close this door. We have a restroom upstairs on the second floor if you need to use it at any point in time. We got ice cold water out front on the porch and the cooler if you need anything. Yeah, and if you want you can go on a porch at any time. We're going to try to amplify the conversation for the back room. As with everything, we start the conversation at one time, people start to fill in, so people are going to come in as we go. And I don't know, I've been excited for this one for like the past, when did we get started on this? Like 2 months ago?
A month? A month or so?
A month or so ago? Okay. But yeah, so we'll get started in a second. The other beautiful thing that you'll notice for anyone is you'll see the sunlight cascade throughout the event. It's going to be really nice. Yeah. Y'all good? Need anything? All right. Just about ready. I'm going to go check in with my folks out there, and then we'll go ahead and get started.
Mic check.
You got a mic check?
Uh-huh.
I'm just gonna don't like the sound. Oh, is that
I
on?
gotta turn it on.
Sorry, I guess you could toggle between them.
Oh, yeah. That's Paul Robeson back. The same since he was here. Okay. Admit all. Turn this weight on. Well, great. All right. You can just keep an eye on that. Okay, thank you. So, welcome everyone. I'm Chris Rogers. I'm the program director here at the Parlor Museum. We're so grateful to have our executive director on hand, Janet Sykes-Ross in the back. Let's say what's up. And this is a collaboration that we were really excited about. It sort of deepens from an original opportunity that we had in February of this year, where the Radical Books Collective led a master class with Dr. Lewis Norton, who we know through Temple University while he was here, and led a master class on Frantz Fanon's. So it makes sense that on Frantz Fanon's birthday, that we would come back for another collaboration. Fanon's ideas will certainly be part of the conversation that we have today. It's all about DECOLONIZE Museums, which is the focus of a new book, which is right here on the table from Shimri Lee. Who's also, in Philly, local. I'm sorry, I'm kind of figuring this thing out. Let me tell you a little bit about the Paul Robeson House Museum. So the Paul Robeson House Museum really has its groundings in the early 90s when Mama Fran, Frances L. Alston, a community librarian who was running the West Philadelphia Cultural Alliance, came together with a plan and learned about the availability of this property. This is Paul Robeson's sister's house, Marian Forsythe. And Robeson, after Eslanda Good Robeson transitioned to Ancestor in 1965, he moved to this home in 1966 and lived here the final decade of his life. And not only do we focus on the time that he spent here on his house and the family that was here to caretake for him, but the legacy of Robeson's family, particularly both on his father's side and his mother's side, have a deep legacy in Philadelphia from his mother's side, the matrilineal side, Bustles. Goes back all the way to the time of the pre-Revolutionary War, patriarch of Cyrus Bustle. While I'm also here, I think it's important that we honor the land that we're on, right? This area of Philadelphia, some of the members of the Lenape-Hokie, Lenni Lenape tribe call it Lower Lenape-Hokie. We are grateful to have, strong relationships with many of local Native organizations. I want to lift up a couple. If you're listening to this, or anyone in the audience, please Google these organizations. We Are the Seeds. It's an amazing arts and cultural nonprofit program. There's a lot of work in spotlighting Native traditions. I also want to lift up Indigenous Peoples Day Philly. Indigenous Peoples Day Philly does. They have really carved out an amazing Indigenous Peoples Day celebration here in Philadelphia. It happens in October every year. I want people to go out and support them. And then there's a new project that's coming into being called Red Feather's Legacy. Red Feather's Legacy is a response. There used to be an Office of Native Affairs here in the city of Philadelphia. For whatever reason, it was defunded and closed. And what the Red Feather's Legacy proposes to do is reopen that space, that Center for Urban Native Visibility, Urban Native Advocacy, and a space to just gather one another. So you can also search and Google that, Red Feather's Legacy. And I like to, when we think about land acknowledgements, I like to go about it that way and to honor that there are continual organizing for Native sovereignty projects that we're always surrounded by. And we always have an opportunity to embrace and support them. So we hope that models just a sense of what it means to be in right relationship with these ongoing current projects. And then other than that, I have to give a shout out to the folks at the Radical Books Collective. I got to know Radical Books Collective directly close to Meg Ehrenberg, who was working in Philly, and the work that they do, and the work of Dr. Bhakti Shingarpare, is really fueling a transnational understanding and appreciation of literature and what that literature says about our world, about understanding our past and present, and really building a liberated future for us all. So search Radical Books Collective, find them online. You might see them under their former name of Warscapes. Support them. They have a Patreon. We're excited to collaborate with them, and we're thinking about more collaborations as well. With those things out of the way, I'm really excited for our panel today. We were really grateful to be able to bring two of our people we work with closely in a number of different fashions, whether in the Ropes House or just Philadelphia community work. We're grateful to have Abdul Ali Muhammad here, amazing community journalist, activist, a part of the Black and Brown Workers Cooperative, one of the 40 power players in our LGBTQ plus community in Philadelphia. I saw that award earlier this week.
I guess.
And it was also, deeply has been leading the campaign for repatriation alongside the MOVE organization here in Philadelphia with the unethical and just unjust, handling and holding of these children's remains, right? We'll learn more about that throughout the conversation. Oh, thank you.
Thank you.
And while we lift up MOVE too, it's also important to acknowledge that the Robeson House is currently in a project alongside Mike Africa Jr., MOVE organization, and building the MOVE Activist Archive. So we're in a process now of finding ways to comb through this history and find ways to exhibit it, where it's not just focused on the sort of extreme state violence that they face, but also about the really freedom forward vision that they put through and the ways they organize across the community to make it a reality. And with that, also I want to lift up our current artist, activist, and residents, Malkia Opetz. Thank you for being here today. Malkia and I, we started collaborating on this book called How We Stay Free, a Robeson House Museum project. I'll make sure everyone in this room gets postcards. We'll put the link in the chat for everybody who's watching. But that book was a way for the Robeson House, while we were closed during the pandemic, of showcasing the amazing amount of community organizing that was happening during 2020 across a number of different avenues. We have Philadelphia Housing Action and the work of housing justice, which we'll be talking about just a little bit later. And we also have the Black Philly Radical Collective, who put together this platform in the war on Black Philadelphia now. We have a mutual aid organization, Buddy Hop. So here's the book here. It's available in bookstores all over. I highly suggest going to Hakeem's bookstore, right at 52nd and Walnut, the second oldest Black bookstore in the country. That's continuously operating. We love them. We work with them a lot. And also Making Worlds over here on 45th Street. What was I? I was lifting up the...
You talking about Bunny Hop, the last thing?
Yeah, Bunny Hop, the mutual aid organization, which is featured in How We Stay Free. So Malkia had this amazing idea about looking at the objects that come through our protest movements and the stories that they tell, and really doing interviews with the folks who volunteered those objects. So you can read more about that and How We Stay Free. And that led to this collaboration where we're building the archive of the Robeson House, but doing so in such a way where we're really opening up how we write history, how we make history, to get our community involved in history in the making of how do we story our histories, right? And when we take the power of that, what can we do with that, right? And lastly, I'll say, many of us after tonight's panel will be headed to the UC Townhomes encampment, which is at 40th and Market Street. The residents of the UC Townhomes have been leading a campaign against their unjust eviction and displacement from
the People's Townhomes.
The People's Townhomes, yes. At 40th and Market that we'll be heading to after this. It's a reception, it's open invite. If you're watching this and you're local in Philly, please meet us over there for refreshments and a mixer so we continue on this conversation at 7:45. It's at 40th and Market. We'll put the link to the campaign in the chat, but in short, it's savetheuctownhomes.com and also Save UC Townhomes on social media. And last but not least, we have our author today. So, Shimrit Lee, educator, with the Brooklyn Institute for Social Research, worked with OR Books to put together this collection, DECOLONIZE Museums. And it lifts up both what I loved about what we're going to do today is both challenging the large institutions of empire and the collections that they've built, while at the same time honoring small and insurgent initiatives, maybe just like our own, that are trying to rewrite how we think about museums and how we think about memory work in our communities, and how that has a deep relationship to building liberation movements. And we know that Robeson in his studies and his scholarship was all about how do we understand people's histories and bring them together to unify us, right? Really across the world. So it's just an organic, authentic connection. I'm really excited to dig deeper into this book. And you can tell us more about it. So without further ado, I'm ready to start our panel for the day. I'm gonna get off y'all way. And thank y'all.
Thank you. Should I use the microphone? I don't know if anyone can.
Yeah, put it close like that.
Is that better? Can you hear me? Okay. Hi everyone, I'm Shimrit, pronouns she, her. I'm so happy to be here. Thank you so much to Chris and the Robeson House for making this possible. Thank you to Bhakti, the fantastic editor of this decolonizing series. Thank you to my wonderful co-panelists, Malkia and Abdul Ali, and to all of you, whether you're here in person or joining us on YouTube. Thank you for making time out of your sweltering hot day to be here with us. As Chris mentioned, much of my book here is transnational in scope. I'm really focusing on the role of the traditional Western museum in upholding notions of white supremacy on a global level. But part of that project is also really honoring struggles against these kinds of erasures by artists and activists. So I'm really excited to be joined by such incredible artists and activists today to root this conversation in a more local context. And yes, I think that it does really honor the spirit of Paul Robeson, who explicitly made these connections by speaking out against US intervention and imperialism in Vietnam and Korea, and connecting that to struggles against racial injustice at home, in which he was not afraid of using the word fascist to describe the system of Jim Crow in the US. And so I think it's really important to honor that legacy by creating these connections between the transnational and the local. And in terms of the structure of the evening, I will kind of be weaving these two things together. I will be reading some short excerpts from the book and then bringing in Makia and Abdul Ali into the conversation around specific themes that I address in the book. And I'm going to begin with a short reading from the intro to my book, which sort of sets the scene for some of the struggles that are taking place globally against the museum in its current form. I begin by talking about a recent controversy over the very definition of the museum that rocked ICOM a few years ago, ICOM being the International Council of Museums, in which they were trying to decide whether it was appropriate that museums be considered political institutions. Okay. Some water first. History shows us that museums have always been simultaneously beloved and contested spaces, both the hand that feeds and a citadel to be stormed, as Lucy Lippard put it. Contemporary protest movements, like the J20 art strike and Strike MoMA, are just the latest chapter in a long and rich story of grassroots activism that has activated the museum as a site of struggle. In the 60s and 70s, groups like the Art Workers Coalition and the Guerrilla Art Action Group mobilized against the Vietnam War. Beginning in the late 1980s, A Day Without Art, Visual AIDS, spotlighted the AIDS crisis. And for decades, groups including the Black Emergency Cultural Coalition, the Ad Hoc Women Artists Committee, and the Guerrilla Girls have protested racist and gendered exclusionary practices in the art world. This story goes back centuries and spans continents. In 1792, for instance, revolutionaries stormed the Tuileries Palace, the home of Louis XIV. Under the newly established republic, the royal collection was transferred to a new public museum, the Louvre, designed to represent the identity of the newly transformed state. During the 1917 Russian Revolution, Bolsheviks stormed the Winter Palace, declaring it to be part of the public Hermitage Museum. That museums are today seen by many as neutral is a testament to the extent that the histories of museum spaces have been buried by their modern operators. To examine those histories is to know that museums are really crime scenes, to use a metaphor proposed by Wandile Kasibe of Iziko Museums of South Africa. Spaces that house the memories of atrocities committed during the colonial period, including theft, murder, and genocide. The Louvre may have revolutionary roots, but its Egyptian antiquities collection is composed of artifacts taken by the French during Napoleon's conquests in the Middle East. Likewise, the British Museum owes much of its collection to Sir Hans Sloane, a collector who financed his expeditions from his wife's earnings as the owner of a slave plantation in Jamaica. Today, it is impossible to find a Western museum that doesn't hold some amount of cultural material from Africa, Asia, Oceania, or Native America, an enduring sign of the devastating afterlives of colonial rule. Wall texts often tell neutral, authoritative narratives of the objects displayed, but that passivity fails to reckon with the extractive nature of colonialism, by which most of the global South was robbed of culture, resources, and people in plain sight. This violence is not over for Indigenous and Black people who continue to suffer under regimes of economic and political inequality and experience macro and microaggressions on a daily basis. The museum, with its white walls and white lights, aids in historical amnesia, tricking visitors into believing that this violence only exists in the past. And from there, I kind of go on to grapple with the meaning of decolonization, and kind of explain that there's no clear blueprint for what a decolonized museum would look like, other than it must involve some sort of deep unsettling for institutions, real material reckoning when it comes to legacies of slavery and colonialism, indigenous land claims, and the recognition of ongoing forms of dispossession and violence. And throughout the book, I look at the role of the artist in unsettling the institution, and different ways in which artists have reconsidered or reimagined what it means to display, to exhibit, to collect, whether these sorts of actions are possible outside of the restrictions of the traditional museum. And so I want to kind of bring Malkia specifically into this conversation as an artist who has reimagined what collecting might look like. Chris mentioned your project of community archiving, in which you had community members submit objects, I think you call them resistance objects, from the 2020 Black Lives Matter uprisings. So I wonder if you could talk to us about that project. What exactly do you mean by resistive objects, and what that process was like?
Yeah, definitely. As Chris mentioned, this is how we started our relationship in memory work and community organizing. And in the aftermath of the 2020 uprisings and the announcement of the How We Stay Free book project, I was thinking a lot about my own analysis of the events that were taking place and what could contribute to thinking about how the events are part of a larger history of resistance in Philadelphia and part of our cultural history. So with that, I thought about, what could I point to start to piece this story together? And it was objects, it was flyers, things I had on me in my backpack, things my friends had, things I saw. And it began to form this tapestry of objects, of resistance objects, or items and things that are part of the story of the 2020 uprisings. So along with that, and along with thinking of what I had, whether it was a nail that flew off the Rizzo statue and how that sort of brought back my memory of what it was like to be there, like under the sun with all the people, and other things like flyers where we can recall what was happening when. I wanted to put a call out to the community to see if other people had objects that they wanted to contribute to the narrative of the uprisings. So with that, I put out a call and a form, and I had folks contribute photos of items, descriptions of them, and basic information and data about them. And I wanted to format it in such a way that the people who were part of the project had agency in the process of how their objects were analyzed, described, and the stories that were told. And I hoped in this process I could sort of use it as an experiment to think about how community collecting and how thinking about archives and community archaeology could really operate in an actual real world example. And sort of what came out of that was about 20 or so objects from different community groups, people who wanted to be anonymous, people who were in the streets, organizers, people from ages 6 to elders in our community. And it sort of captured every corner of what was happening, at least in my opinion, from late May to July 2020. And I thought it was a really beautiful way to sort of think about what was going on.
Thank you. That's so fascinating. And I think the word agency is really important here, because I do think of instances in which museums create space for these sorts of collections, but oftentimes they kind of turn into like salvage projects, as if these communities are somehow disappearing and the museum has to hold on to them, or they're kind of just ways to diversify the collection, sort of like an add-on. And so I wonder, I mean, is there a way you think that these sorts of projects could become part of traditional museums in the future? And if so, like, what circumstances need to be in place for that to happen?
Well, in my opinion, the museum, as it currently stands and its traditional structure, cannot proceed and be a liberatory space. And I think part of decolonization work has to be a complete reimagining of what a cultural heritage space and a history space looks like, and how people want to learn about each other and the stories that we want to tell with each other. I think the current format, which relies on collections, like permanent collections or trading collections amongst each other around the Western world, I think that a lot of efforts right now that sort of use decolonization as a metaphor to sort of refer to the piece by Tuck and Yang, they're sort of ways to proceed the way they have been while having a front-facing image that looks better. And I think it's important that when we're seeing museums take on like DEI projects and things like that, that we're really taking a look at and analyzing what's actually going on behind the scenes. Like, what collections do they have? Who are they in conversation with that has these collections, whether it's indigenous collections or different African collections, et cetera, et cetera. Is repatriation happening? Is there an active effort to change the course of power and ownership that ultimately what makes museums what they are today?
Absolutely. Yes, absolutely. And I think this kind of brings me to our next topic on repatriation, because I do love that you're really centering stories and voices and non-traditional objects, but it's still the case that objects really form the foundation of so many conflicts and debates that are happening in the museum world when it comes to repatriation. So I'm going to go ahead and read another short excerpt from the book, and then I'm going to open up the conversation. I would love to hear more about your own project with digitization, and I also want to hear about your work, Abdul-Ali, on repatriation in Philly. But I'm going to just read a short excerpt to introduce the topic. And this is just the first couple of pages from my first chapter. And I'm sure you all will be familiar with this pop culture reference. The 2018 film Black Panther may be best known as the first Black superhero blockbuster, but it offers plenty of lessons for students of decolonization. Early in the film, the villain Eric Killmonger Stevens, played by Michael B. Jordan, stands in front of a glass museum display, examining a selection of African artifacts inside. He is approached by a white curator who condescendingly offers to tell him about the display. As she explains that the exhibited warhammer was made in the 7th century by the Fula tribe in Benin, he quickly contradicts her. Nah. I beg your pardon, she inquires. It was taken by British soldiers in Benin, but it's from Wakanda, he says, referencing the fictional sub-Saharan African country. I'm going to take it off your hands for you. When the curator tells him that items aren't for sale, Killmonger confronts her. How do you think your ancestors got these? Do you think they paid a fair price? Or did they take it like they took everything else? Just then, the curator, poisoned by her coffee, collapses on the floor. Killmonger and his team smash the glass display case and take off with the hammer. While this is fiction, it's representative of the very real issues in museums today. Killmonger's very presence in the museum as a visitor of color is noteworthy, given that just over 6% of visitors to US museums are Black. As Lisa Radbier points out in Hyperallergic, Killmonger's co-conspirator, disguised as a museum cafe worker, points to the hierarchical divisions between a museum's diverse service workers and a predominantly white curatorial staff. The scene also raises questions about the retelling of colonial narratives and who gets to tell these stories. Above all, it brings up the issue of unethical acquisition practices, which fits into a long history of colonists robbing African artifacts to put on display for European consumption. The scene is set at the Museum of Great Britain, a thinly veiled reference to London's British Museum, which has long been embroiled in its own debates over acquisition and repatriation. The institution currently faces calls from Nigeria's National Commission for Museums and Monuments to return the Benin bronzes, which British soldiers looted in an 1897 raid. Recently, a real-life episode reminded me of this scene from Black Panther. On June 13, 2020, Congolese activist Mwazulu Diabanza wrestled a 19th century wooden funerary post from its fixings in Paris's Musée Cape Branly, while declaring to a live stream audience on Facebook, "No one has the right to take what belongs to the African people because it is our heritage," end quote. Together with 4 other activists, Diabanza triumphantly carried the post through the museum, shouting, "We're bringing it home." Museum guards eventually stopped them, but their point had been made. Even before he went on trial, Diabanza sued the French state for the same crime he allegedly committed, theft. Some museum conservators viewed Diabanza's act as a reckless incident of vandalism. Others, however, viewed his act as a demonstration of radical visual protest, a reclaiming of African cultural heritage that had been forcibly taken during the colonial period. The tension between these two views is emblematic of the clashes between museums and formerly colonized people when it comes to questions of repatriation, that is, the return of stolen cultural materials to their countries of origin. And of course, since writing this book, much has happened in the world of repatriation. A lot of this is now outdated because a number of countries have agreed to various repatriation, but it's still very much a struggle. And recently it actually came to light that the UK-based Institute of Digital Archaeology had created a robot to construct an identical model of the Elgin Marbles, perhaps one of the most well-known artifacts that the Greek government has been reclaiming from the British Museum for decades now. So now there's this argument that this 3D replica might be able to be housed at the British Museum, and the authentic version could go back to Greece. And so there's also a much longer history of artists using digital reproduction. The work of artist Flourishing Alayari, she 3D prints artifacts that were destroyed by ISIS in Iraq. And so there are all these creative ways that artists are thinking through repatriation. Meanwhile, European governments are dragging their feet on this issue. And so I was thinking of these digital projects when I saw your work using 3D technology, UAV imaging to reproduce various artifacts and kind of reimagining cultural heritage. So I wonder, Mahia, if you could talk about this Futures project and what you say, what do museums look like in the future? Are they museums anymore? This is the question that goes along with this project. So I'm wondering if you could speak about your approach to reconstruction.
Yeah, so for context, I studied archaeology as an undergrad. I worked at the Penn Museum, and that's where I was trained. And as I was pursuing the program and as I was getting ready to graduate, I realized more and more how problematic the methodology I was learning was, how violent the space was. And I was thinking about the different strategies and archaeological practices I was taught and how I could sort of reclaim those practices for decolonial work. And one thing that I did a lot of and was very interested in is using innovative technologies to do museum education and to do cultural heritage education, one of which is 3D modeling. And I started to notice that 3D modeling sort of had become an excuse or a stand-in for the repatriation conversation. sort of saying we can copy objects, we can copy artifacts. You can access it online, so why do you want it like in person again? That sort of thing. And the artist Alighieri was actually a big inspiration for me, and particularly her concept of digital colonialism and how digital spaces are just as violent as the physical ones and just as capable of reproducing this violence. So with that, I was thinking about my own cultural heritage and particularly the Luo ethnic group in Kenya, and I wanted to do an exercise in looking up artifacts that are Kenyan and sort of seeing how I reacted to them and what I could do with it. So I looked in Penn Museum's database for Kenyan Luo artifacts, and what I found was really inconsistent, a lot of which was described as British East African. And I was like, okay, sometimes they call it Kenya, sometimes they call it British East Africa. This is bizarre. And I expanded my search to other museums, and I found the Pitts Rivers Museum had a photographic archive of Luo materials. So I was like, I want to do a digitization of some of the objects that I've seen in these pictures and sort of use it as a creative or a mental exercise to sort of see how I felt with the process of finding these things, trying to learn more about myself and my culture, which is presumably what you want to do when you're looking at a museum database, and sort of think about the idea of the future museum as a space where we're reclaiming those tools and we're thinking of new ways to use them to sort of take that power back. So in digitization, it's sort of like digitization for digitization's sake is what I call it, where people want to use the sexy technology to get the grants, to get the funding, and to like just have these cool projects and make these cool things. But what if we looked at digitization as a craft making process in and of itself? So in my process of creating the 3D model of these objects, which were different adornment objects in the Luo culture, I was taking my time, I was thinking about each piece, just like I would if I was dealing with physical objects, and it was sort of a creative exercise to see if we had the ownership and the power of these digital technologies and not massive corporations harvesting our data, like what would that look like? Not as a solution for the now, but just as a way to dream and imagine of what could be if we do decolonize these processes.
It's really beautiful. And I think it, the kind of yes and attitude is really interesting, because a lot of arguments that the British Museum, for example, has made in the past is that this is the cultural heritage of all of humanity. So let's just put it online. We don't need to repatriate anything. And I mean, there's something to be said about kind of fetishizing objects, as you said, but justice cannot be achieved if these objects are not returned to their rightful owners. And I think that can happen, and there can be these spaces for digitization, which can be extremely important and meaningful as a craft. I love that you framed it as a practice of creation. So that's really wonderful. And I kind of want to now turn towards maybe a slightly darker topic on what happens when we talk about human remains as part of the repatriation process as well. And so I'm going to ask you to speak about your work, but first I want to read another excerpt from my book in which I introduce this topic of human remains when it comes to repatriation. In the 19th century, anthropologists and archaeologists circled the globe to dig up graves and buy and sell bones from dealers. This was all done in the name of scientific research. Scholars used human remains to explain physical and cultural differences between people. The measurements of cranial capacity and skull shape, for instance, helped to prop up theories of white supremacy. While this kind of behavior was common in virtually all colonies, it was rampant in settler colonies. Take the case of Southwest Africa, now known as Namibia. From 1884 to 1915, German settlers rushed to the region to create a homeland abroad. In response, between 1904 and 1908, the Herero and Nama ethnic groups launched a rebellion, which resulted in what is now considered the first genocide of the 20th century. Tens of thousands were killed through battle, starvation, and thirst. Many more suffered forced labor, medical experiments, and disease in concentration camps. Germany's intent was to rid the colony of people viewed as expendable and thus gain access to their land. In 1906, Austrian anthropologist Felix von Luschen urged the overseers of those Herero and Nama concentration camps to gather bones and ship them to him in Berlin for research purposes. Herero women were forced to use shards of glass to scrape away the flesh from the corpses of their loved ones for this purpose. Luschen eventually sold his entire personal collection of human remains, including skulls belonging to the Herero people, to the American Museum of Natural History in New York, AMNH. Henry Fairfield Osborne, the president of AMNH at the time, was eager to obtain the collection in order to advance his own studies of backward races based on skull analysis. The purchase doubled the AMNH's physical anthropology collection. Since 2017, the remains have been wrapped up in legal battles. The AMNH has repeatedly turned down requests by descendants of the victims to inspect the skeletal remains of 8 individuals said to be of Namibian descent. And on September 24th, 2020, a U.S. federal court in New York dismissed a class action lawsuit that had been filed by the Herero and Nama peoples to demand Germany pay reparations. Despite these setbacks, the Herero and Nama continue their fight for justice. And I go on to talk about more of these struggles and introduce the history of NAGPRA, which is the Native American Graves Protection Act, Graves Protection and Repatriation Act, excuse me. And so this act passed in 1990 after a great struggle by Native American communities to have the human remains of their ancestors returned to them from various museums and academic institutions. This requires federal agencies and museums to return human remains upon the request of Native American communities. And yet NAGPRA is very limited. If these human remains are found abroad, they do not apply. It's only US based. And there are many cases in which NAGPRA just does not apply at all. For example, the Horton collection at UPenn has recently been in the news for its collection of the remains of enslaved Black Philadelphians, which were most likely torn from burial grounds around the Philadelphia General Hospital and Philadelphia Almshouse. And so these remains were used to fuel scientific research, that justified white supremacist viewpoints. And so I wanted to open up the floor to you, Abdul Ali, in your own work and reporting around this. And without the protection of NAGPRA, I wonder, what, if any, are the legislative paths forward? What does justice look like in this case? And maybe a little bit about how you became involved with this issue as well.
Thank you, Shimri. Hello?
Gary, thank you, Shimri, for that question. Thank you, Malkia. Thank you, Chris and Paul Robeson-House. I guess I'll start with a bit of history around how I got involved in the conversation of repatriation. In 2019, April of 2019, the University of Penn hosted a symposium over 2 days, I believe, exploring Penn's complicity in the transatlantic slave trade. And this kind of surfaced after other universities, histories resurfaced about Brown University and other universities' complicity and benefit, right, financial benefit from the institution of slavery. And I saw it, I think, on Facebook, and I was like, this is something I've been thinking about as a West Philadelphian, right? Penn is an old institution. What is Penn's relationship to slavery? And I went to the symposium, and I think I was immediately stunned by a lot of what I heard, which was kind of like, oh, this is just academic research. And for me, as someone who's a non-academic, probably non-academic, it kind of jarred me emotionally how easy it was to talk about a glass cabinet in an anthropology classroom inside a Penn museum where crania of indigenous, Black and other folks were on display, right? Where students had to interact with the remains of people stolen away on a daily basis. And it was so much talked about, but I think what really struck me was two people spoke that I really was, a lot of people spoke that over the course of those 2 days. But I want to uplift Shawande Musakim, a scholar who wrote a book, Slavery at Sea, talking about how Black folks, how Africans were treated, murdered, discarded as they journeyed here without consent, right? So she talked about a story of an enslaved person who had become ill on the ship coming to the United States, and as someone who's HIV positive, it kind of stuck out to me, this idea of a sick person who's, being taken away from their home, and how on the vessel they had quarantine, right? They had spaces to quarantine folks who became ill, and how the enslaver documents this in his journal. So he talks about, this person and how frustrated he was that they had to kind of quarantine this person, that this person is sick and wouldn't get better. And then eventually he decides that the best thing to do is discard this person alive. And so he talks about lifting this person who is tied, is shackled to a chair, and him and his other shipmates grip the chair up and throw her overboard. They don't have a name for her, and his last remark in his journal is that, isn't it a shame that I had to throw away a perfectly fine chair? So to me, that was heartbreaking to hear, that this person is only captured as having been disposed of, as having been sick and enslaved, and doesn't have a name, right? No one knows this person's name. No one knows when she was thrown overboard, the agony, the deep violence that she, that was enacted on her in her life, and how easily she was discarded in this way. And what struck me about that story was that we often talk about when people get here and what they experienced here. We sometimes talk about the journey here and what happened. But it just made me think of all the names of the unknown people who were discarded like that, who we may not know ever about. And so that made me really, really angry. And then the second thing that really stuck out to me about this symposium, and it's all on YouTube, you can search the speeches of the scholars, was when student scholars talked about the Penn Slavery Project, which is how we met. And they talked about Samuel George Morton, who you kind of talk about his collection in your book, and about his race science. Samuel George Morton was a physician who went to Penn, taught at Penn in kind of the early iteration of what is now Penn Medicine, or Penn's University of Penn, whatever, medical school. And he had people globally ship him remains that they had grave robbed. And recently, the letter surfaced where he actually talks about that, says, I want you to rob some graves to one of his folks in Central America. And so Morton collected crania that were mostly grave robbed, and a lot of those crania still exist today at Penn Museum. And at the time that this symposium happened in 2019, they were still being displayed. And so it angered me, one, because he's a white supremacist. He used his data points that he gathered from the crania to try to prove his theory of races, which was basically that the Ethiopian race, which is black people, right, was the least intelligent by measuring the cranial capacity of people by race and by filling the skulls with lead shot. Sometimes it's been documented, and he also had this thing where he sometimes would put cotton in the eye sockets of the crania. And so that was very disturbing to hear. And my immediate reaction was visceral. I got really, really hot. And I wanted something done about it, because as an organizer, I'm like, something needs to happen. So I kind of start talking to the scholars about this at the symposium afterwards. And, while people mostly were like, yeah, it's messed up, it's kind of, it's what archaeology and anthropology is about. This is what it's about, right? So that was mostly the response. And so I created a change.org petition saying that, that these remains should be returned. I didn't have the language of repatriation until later. And then I wrote an op-ed, and it was in the context of the Democratic candidates for president talking about reparations. And so it's talking about Penn's owing reparations to black folks, right? And needing to return these remains. That's how I got involved in the conversation. Sorry, I know that was long.
That was great, thank you. And I'm really struck by this tension that I hear between, on the one hand, disposability of people's humanity, disposability of humans, and this idea of collecting, which is permanent, and the desire to hold on to these sorts of collections. So there's this interesting kind of back and forth between disposability and permanence. And the Morton collection is sort of the tip of the iceberg, I think, with these sorts of issues. You've also reported extensively on how the Penn Museum and Princeton University have been holding on to the remains of child victims of the 1985 Louvre bombing, when Philadelphia police basically dropped a bomb on a West Philly residence, killing multiple people from the African family. And some of these remains from child victims have, again, been used for research, teaching tools without the family's consent or knowledge. And the city announced that in addition, there were Louvre remains in the medical examiner's office, kind of prompting the city to conduct an independent investigation into what exactly went wrong. And I know that you kind of have your finger on the pulse of this story, so I'd be very curious to hear what exactly this report reveals, maybe what it doesn't reveal, and how it kind of connects to the conversation we're having about scientific racism and museums.
Thank you for that question. I first want to just lift up Tree Africa, Patricia Tree Africa, and Delisha Africa, the two children who who were in an unexhibitioned collection at the museum. I get really angry when I talk about this, so bear with me, because a lot of the public discourse kind of around Penn and their actions and Princeton continues the dehumanization of them, you know, because it hinges on the curator who was the student of an anthropologist at the time in 1985 who had been hired by the city to help in the original investigation into the Louvre bombing. And in kind of the way that what I've been learning as someone who just doesn't have you know, this idea of like legal jargon of how people are legally protected through the language they use. Doesn't sit well with me, right? Because some of the language used is unidentified, unknown, Jane Doe, to separate the violence that happened, or to suggest that the violence was for the purpose of restoring personhood, right? We needed to figure out who these remains belong to. That's why we had them for 30 plus years. So I'm just sitting with all of that, and also I just want to uplift that there's some remains of Patricia and some remains of Delisha still unaccounted for. The remains of the two children still unaccounted for in the context of 3 investigations. Where are their remains? Where are their remains? And so you mentioned the city's report that was conducted by 2 law firms. I want to say that while I appreciate how the 2 law firms spent a lot of time and attention on the chain of custody, how did these remains get to the museum from the medical examiner's office in Philadelphia, who was involved, is still inadequate in their recommendations, right? The recommendations is that the medical examiner's office do better. You know, no one is being held accountable. There's no accountability there, and ultimately, I don't know if accountability or quote unquote justice will ever happen, right? I think as a Black person, I'm practiced in understanding that this world is just unjust. And even we can talk about justice and what it feels like, what it looks like, but in my experience, it's in a lot of ways unattainable, right? Because it requires the world to be transformed. It requires institutions to be ruptured. And it requires the kind of thing that I don't think we're in a space for as a nation. And so I don't know if there is justice, but I think I want to uplift the demand of the MOVE organization, which is to free Mumia Jamal, to free him from incarceration. And again, I just, throughout this past year plus, it's been really, really heartbreaking. It's been really heartbreaking to do the work of thinking about people in their afterlives that have been systematically targeted, murdered, and dismissed. Is heavy. It's heavy work, and it's not even. I'm not the most harmed here. You know, I'm not the mother, the brother, the sister, the sibling of these folks. And yet, as a West Philadelphian, having to read about very sensitive things in the archive about young people who were murdered, where, you know, if it were other folks, they would be protected, even in the archive. You know what I mean? Like, some things would be redacted, some things would be taken out. There will be more care in how the materials are treated. For example, in the city archives, there's a box from the medical examiner's office from the investigation that was found in 2017 when, the remains were found where the former health commissioner said dispose of these remains, cremate these remains. Farley, did y'all hear about this story? So the former health commissioner in Philadelphia disclosed after the revelation of Penn Museum holding the remains of moved bombing victims that in 2017 he had authorized a subordinate to cremate the remains found in a box at the medical examiner's office. He then was asked to resign from the mayor, and then within days they found the remains. We found the box. And it's more than likely more than just one box that they found. But with that box, they also found records from the investigation that were just haphazardly taken to the city archives. No one categorized it. No one even kind of took care to, like, you know, carefully assess what was in the box. You can get the box, and it's as it was in the 80s. You see little like mailings from the medical examiner at the time. It's with the original notes on it. There's health information of the children. There's birth certificates. There's information about their families, medical history. That's just inappropriate, I think, for a public archive. But because of the way that the system has come after moving people, it aligns with the treatment, the desecration, right, the murder, all of it is in alignment with how dehumanizing this world is to Black folks and Black radical people.
Thank you. And thank you for all of your work on this issue and emotional labor, frankly. It's clear that there are so many different layers of trauma, ongoing trauma through the lack of care, lack of accountability, even the language and methodologies that you were explaining, kind of the sanitizing language is extremely dehumanizing. And it just makes me think, like, what does healing actually look like? Can it ever be achieved? And I think what you said about needing this rupture of change made me think about the question of reparations. People often talk about restitution or repatriation or return, but there's also this fourth R, reparation. And so I wonder, and I know the Morton Collection Committee, they had a reparations committee, so this was part of the conversation. But I know that reparations can mean different things for different people. So I guess the question for both of you is, how do you see reparations, and do you see museums contributing to any sort of enduring, meaningful healing processes through reparations? I know that's a big question.
I'm sorry, I was going to say something very quick. To answer that, and also sort of follow on what Abdul-Ali was talking about before, one thing I noticed that from both the Morton collection situation and the move remains is the cognitive dissonance these institutions have between the past and the present, and how they're interlinked and impact the future of, everything, of our communities. And this sort of, I was thinking before too with salvage anthropology, how it's like inherently almost paradoxical that there's a simultaneous cultural collecting and also cultural erasure. And today we are expected that these collections, that these events are in the past, and the past is very much separate from right now. And therefore museums feel like they're in an optimal position to continue as they are because they're the gatekeepers of that history, the owners of it. And I think as we proceed into a conversation about reparations, that is very much a part of it because of how ownership and the autonomy of communities impacted by that cultural collecting, where are they in, the grand scheme of things?
Thank you, Makia. First, I want to start, because I think at a certain point we're going to talk about abolition. So I just want to, wrote something down earlier when I was thinking about the questions today. And it's about rupture, about like the need for rupture to the normalcy of the objectification and systemic dehumanization and desecration of sacred things and remains. That there absolutely needs to be, I know the word reckoning is used often. So maybe it's not reckoning, maybe it's burned down, maybe it's repurposed, maybe it's tear down brick by brick. Whatever combination of words that we need to come up with that signifies tearing down institutions. I'm sorry, I'm not eloquent, y'all. Tearing down the institutions, I don't know how to say that in academic speak. And in terms of reparations, I mean, for me, it's very easy. The white supremacy is extractive, right? Capitalism, racial capitalism, the very formation of it is about money, right? It's more than money, obviously, but it's about money and about control and ownership of property. And so when I think about reparations, I'm thinking about how Pitt Museum is sought out for its data on enslaved people because of the crania of enslaved people in the Morton collection, right? And people want to know the density of the bone and information about who these folks might have been. And so there's a digital archive of some of the remains, right? There's deep interest by scientists to find out more and extract more information from these bones that were torn from a burial site, right? And Penn is known for this collection. They made so much money off of the possession of these remains. They absolutely must return that money, that ill-gotten money, to Black folks, period. That's just, it's plain and simple to me. It's not really like it's not a theory. It's like just
$20 billion endowment.
That part.
$20 billion endowment.
It's that Rihanna song, pay me what you, okay, that's reparations. That's honestly, Rihanna wrote a book on reparations, y'all. Just in that bar. But no, simply like they've extracted and continue to extract from Black folks, from indigenous people, from other folks. And they just have to pay that money. And then, yes, there's other conversations about reparative actions outside of just the monetary piece, right? There needs to be something that disrupts the campus, just in the same way that you have these statues of, so-and-so Prescott, who was a early contributor to Penn, or so-and-so was the first provost, and they're on a horse and weird stance, always like with a finger up, or some weird statue to uplift a white person, typically white men, in all their like greatness, right? There needs to be things that disrupt the campus, that remind people daily of the brutal violence that that Penn is built on. You know, it's not good enough just to have a digital augmented reality app. That's an inside thing. You know, you need to reckon with the fact that for 30 plus years, the Penn Museum held in a box the remains of Black children, separated from their other remains that were buried in 85 and 86, right? You need to know when you come on Penn's campus that they had the plenty of Black Philadelphians that were buried at what is now Penn, Franklin Field, right? That was our alms house burial site. So underneath that, there still remains. And so people need to know that. And so there's other reparative actions, but yes, pay me what you owe me.
Yes, I love that as the kind of song to go along with this book. Yeah, I really appreciate you bringing up the material, financial aspect of this. As Malkia, you mentioned in the beginning, you know, decolonization can sometimes just be like a buzzword used to, you know, if we hire more diverse faculty or curators, we're kind of doing an easy check off our checklist. But if you're not actually going to reckon with, you know, what you've stolen in terms of material, financial wealth, then these gestures can be really empty and meaningless. And I think reparations also, for me, brings up the question of time, especially with your work, and you were talking about how the past is so present with us today because these wounds are still completely open. We're not dealing with these wounds. And I appreciate you saying that even as your work is very speculative and deals with different sorts of futures, which is really beautiful layering of this past, present, and future. And you mentioned abolition, so we should just go into that. I know that both of you have done work with abolition. I know, Malkia, I was looking at your work on the historical uses of the term abolition. And we often hear this word applied to museums, thinking about, you know, can we reform the museum, or should we just abolish it, or at least abolish it in its current formation? So I wonder if you have thoughts on this, if you've thought about the application of abolition to museums, either of you, or both of you.
I'll start, thank you. So when I thought about this question before about how does abolitionism tie into museums, and I think this ties well to what you were saying, Abdullah, about money and this sort of financial foundation of the violence of these institutions enact. If we understand abolition to be the destruction of police and prison and carceral infrastructure, and how that ties to capitalism, how that ties to white supremacy. Museums are very much a part of that story. And I think Penn is one very big literal example. In the past, its foundation being built on the finances of enslavement, and in the present, having an active financial relationship with the Philadelphia police, and having its own police force, and contributing to the Philadelphia Police Foundation. So there's sort of this cyclical nature of how this violence is feeding into each other, and how for a museum or any museum to have those sorts of ties, whether it's Penn Museum or whether it's the British Museum and its ties to slavery in Jamaica, or there's a spreadsheet that I found, and I could find the link and give it to people, but it was this anonymous group of museum workers who started to keep track of how are different museums tied to police departments. And there's another thing that came out of the 2020 uprisings, and I remember the Minneapolis Museum of Art. It started with looking at them and their relationship to the Minneapolis Police Department, and I know that Chicago was also People in Chicago were looking at that as well, and I'm not sure if that's been rectified or not. I'm not sure if the spreadsheet is still being updated, but it opens up this question about how are museums now contributing to carceral institutions, and how are they contributing to policing in a metaphorical sense as well as, who has access to these materials, who can see them and when and how and all of that, and sort of policing the nature of how people develop relationships with cultural heritage and with the material culture along with that. So yeah, it's more thoughts and ideas as opposed to a solution or like a definite thing, but abolition of museums is definitely a pertinent thing to be thinking about right now, because what's going on right now can't continue.
Thank you. I know you probably see my feet poking out the bottom.
Oh, no, you
Let me get it. I'm having like a muscle spasm, but I'm trying to stretch it out.
Yeah.
Thank you, Maki, for bringing that up and uplifting this idea of the connectedness between museums and policing, literally those connections. Can I go back and answer something that I don't think I answered earlier, and I didn't remember about? You had asked about NAGPRA and what can be done now for remains that aren't protected under NAGPRA, so I'm going to start there and then talk about abolition, if that's cool. So after the repatriation conversation started around Morton and Cranial Collection, I started talking to a lot of folks who are PAs about, in particular, there's a project called the Remembrance Project that is stewarded by the William Way LGBT Center in Philadelphia. And so in the context of talking about repatriation of remains at institutions, it came up that in the early AIDS epidemic here in Philadelphia, there were only 2 local funeral homes that would bury people who had died of AIDS. And they were automatically cremated, and one of those funeral homes still has the remains of at least 10 people that died early in the epidemic whose remains never were picked up by family or loved ones. And so I began to think about what legislatively we could do about not just African remains at institutions, but also this concept of when someone dies and there aren't folks to care for them in their afterlives, or decide not to care for them in their afterlives. And so I drafted something that I call the Stewardship Act, which I sent to the ACLU locally. They never responded, but I sent it to them to help me think about legally, as someone who's not a lawyer, how might that be framed legally. And the idea was simple. It was this, that folks with the same kind of cultural heritage from descendant communities, from who shared either identities around disease, in particular thinking about HIV, right? Who share other kind of cultural identities with people may be not empaneled, but may be organized around thinking about a ritual that this person might have wanted, because sometimes we don't know, right? We know that sometimes we know the names and we know what their religious background was or their cultural background, and so kind of convening a stewardship body to explore that person's history to then decide on what an appropriate series of actions around ritual and ceremony might be to honor that person who wasn't honored rightfully, in the right way, I think, or correctly, in my mind, in the right way when they died. And then quickly about abolition, I think that this concept of a stewardship body for thinking about remains of people, like the Stewardship Act, can be applied to thinking about repatriation, right? That instead of these universities creating committees, because they love creating committees, to disrupt actual organizing. You know, let's get a committee to think about it. And then the committee recommendations completely disagree with the original demands. Don't you, have you noticed that? You have this, I just want to name that, just name it. You have organizing that happens.
Right.
Right? You have this consciousness raising. You have demands. And then all of a sudden, the institution, when they can't ignore it anymore, like because of the 2020 uprising, okay, they respond, right? We're going to look into it. We impaneled a committee to think about repatriation. And ultimately, even if there's good things in those recommendations, it all comes down to they decide, which is the ultimate violence. You don't get to decide when you're the source of the harm. You shouldn't get to decide. You should give all the resources to decisions being made to other people in descendant communities. So in terms of abolition, I think museums should be closed. I was thinking about, am I going to be politically correct today? Museums like Penn Museum, I personally feel like they should be closed. And the material that they have in their collections need to be returned. And they need to give all that money in their endowment or whatever it is, that pot of money, to places like Paul Robeson House, to projects like IKEA's Resistance Objects projects. There's other like ways that quote unquote museums can exist. Like there's small collections. Do y'all remember this? It's a black woman who died some years ago. I forget her name. Who recorded TV? Like she recorded.
She's a communist, and that.
Yeah, she recorded like commercials and stuff.
There's a movie about it.
And she had this huge archive of video. I like this idea of uplifting the personal community archive, like what Paul Robeson House is doing. Why not invest in that versus collections that were collected out of violence? Why not support, something like what you're doing, which is, with consent and in community with people? Why not support Paul Robeson House that has for a number of years struggled, right, financially to like keep the mortgage, to like be a space for community? Why not support this space to like do archiving work, to be a museum, to have exhibitions, to have these conversations? I'm sure y'all could use $1 million, $2 million, $3 million, deck it all out, have a backyard, whatever. So that's
one thing I wanted to bring up along with all this, and not to rant. So there's the Philadelphia Museum collection.
Whoa. Yeah. That's it.
Yes, that has been purchased by Drexel University. And what is that? 1 million things?
Like items?
Items?
Yeah.
I think it's over 1 million items.
The Atwater Kent Museum.
Yes. And these are like part of Philadelphia cultural history, XYZ. I'm not quite sure the exact scope of the collection, but in the work I've been doing here with Chris on trying to think about how to make Paul Robeson House also a community archiving center space, and thinking about how we could provide resources to teach folks how they can preserve their history and document it, and or how we can collaborate on envisioning that, because instructions on how to conserve something can be played with and shouldn't be a rigorous static thing. But anyways, one thing that we talked about is what in the now can be done in terms of decolonization. Well, another large gentrifying institution that has enacted violence in West Philadelphia has been given the stewardship over a very large collection of Philadelphian artifacts. And right now there's not much information about what's going to be done with the collection, who's going to be involved. I know it's a real estate guy that was part of securing that acquisition.
John Fry.
John Fry?
He was the president of Drexel.
Yes, and we all know that Drexel and Penn and real estate, speaking of with the UC townhomes, the People's Townhomes campaign that's going on right around the corner, I think it's really important for us to think in the now about how we can mobilize around a very real group of objects that we can try to garner power over seeing what can be done with it and asking the question, who owns this, how are we going to study it? And it's not just we're going to study it and make the information available, but it's literally like, how is this going to be approached, period? Because we can't, keep proceeding like traditional research projects. It's just unsustainable for the things that we're thinking about.
Wow, thank you both. I have so much that is happening in my mind. I think I just want to respond briefly to the Stewardship Act, which is a very fascinating idea. One of the limits of NAGPRA is that if you are to claim a human remain, you have to have scientific DNA proof that the remains come from whatever tribe is making a claim to them, which is of course very limiting within this box of science as we know it. And so I know a number of indigenous activists have tried to remake the definition of stewardship and try to make claims on, for example, remains of unidentified, so-called unidentified people, and kind of create the sense of collective claiming, which is, I do talk about that in the book a little bit. So it's really fascinating to have it be connected to the work that you're doing as well.
Can I respond to that real quick? I'm sorry. Oh,
Go for it.
Okay. I just real quick want to respond to that around the DNA piece, because that's the same argument that they're using for why Penn has used in the past for why they can't repatriate certain remains, because they don't know for certain where they originated from. So, for example, there's crania that was purchased by Morton from Cuba. And most of those folks are believed to have been enslaved in their lifetimes. And so I just want to say that in talking about the need for DNA, it leads to further desecration, because they have to take parts of the bones that they have, and like the example of the crania, like, and crush down the crania more. So you have to further disturb the remains in order to receive the information that you need to then return them, which to me doesn't seem like a good idea or like an ethical thing to do.
Talk about eugenics, too.
Do you want to make a comment about it?
I'm just going to make a brief note. Since we're talking about eugenics as well, and thinking about like who has to put all the effort in to figure out how you're connected to objects. Who's jumping through all the hoops? It's not white people, it's not white cultural heritage.
Yeah, for sure. Yeah, I also appreciate you bringing up gentrification as yet another, again, financial aspect to all of this, what some people call gentrification. Sometimes where you have, UPenn, Drexel, real estate developers continuously buying up property, pushing out long-term residents. So this is another layer of this story. I do talk about this a little bit in the book when it comes to so-called urban regeneration projects, such as the expansion of the Guggenheim and the Louvre. What comes up most often in these conversations is the way that workers are treated in these projects, mostly migrants from Southeast Asia working in horrific conditions, being underpaid or not paid, and meanwhile we have these huge buildings created by starchitects kind of attracting the global elite. So there's this big disconnect there, and it's happening here on a local scale as well.
Frank Gehry, right?
Yeah, exactly, starchitect. And so I'm glad that, you've been involved in the UC townhomes. I wonder if you want to talk about that a little bit, either of you?
I can talk about it.
Yeah.
Yeah, go for it.
Uh,
And I also want to make sure that there's time for Q&A, so we can start wrapping up shortly. But yeah, please go
Yeah,
ahead.
thank you. I see some organizers in the building too. If you feel the spirit, come on up. You know what I'm saying? I'm gonna do my best though. But the organizing that's happening at the People's Townhomes, which is located at 40th Market, and I think it's important that you mention about like that Drexel purchased the Atwater Kent Museum, which is this museum that is supposed to narrate about Philadelphia history. So just imagine when you have, Drexel University is partners in this project called Schuylkill Yards. It's $3.5 billion transformation of West Philadelphia that they are promising to bring, more tech sector jobs, the knowledge economy, and really ground that in Philadelphia. And just imagine what that means when they have the keys to narrativize our public memory of how we get to this point and what communities and populations are there. So the folks at the UC Townhomes, the People's Townhomes now, right? But the genesis of that of that housing project comes out of a response from community organizing that was happening in the late 60s, early 70s, as they watched, you see the erasure of the Black Bottom neighborhood in West Philadelphia, this strong Black community that still continues to have the Black Bottom reunion and picnic.
Black Bottom Archive.
The Black Bottom Archive, folks like Dr. Walter Palmer in Philadelphia are leading that work. And after the city partnered with the university and they created these sort of they innovated on these public-private business partnership districts to create this thing called University City District. We're part of eminent domaining an area. The community organizers came up and said, we want to preserve affordable housing for the Black community in this area. And that's how the genesis of this project called the University City Townhomes came into being. The community land trust that was at the beginning there, with many organizing projects, sometimes they fall apart, right? And that land and the management of that housing was passed to Altman Management for basically $1, and the intention was to preserve affordable housing in that area. This was in the early 80s. Now, with the rise of this sort of skyscrapers, this life science, eds and meds economy in Philadelphia, that land that the homes are sitting on, the Philadelphia Business Journal reported that land is worth up to $100 million for the ability to build a new sort of research center skyscraper. The owner is now a private developer who now owns that home that is contracted with HUD and not, the city can't just take that, right? It's privately held. It's part of this whole sort of neoliberal response to urban renewal and how we get here. So he ended the contract and is looking to evict more than 68 families there on that property. And basically saying, well, we'll provide HUD vouchers. But as anyone knows in the city who is familiar with our low-income housing system, this is wait lists. There's certainly lots of parts of the neighborhoods that are not accepting Section 8 vouchers. There's still overwhelmingly huge waiting lists right now. But what this, owner is intending is that everybody has to leave so I can continue to, make profit on what I quote unquote rightfully own, right? So the residents there are taking a stand, right? One, in saying that we want to fight the unfair, unjust eviction, but also that this is a stand because not only is it the UC town, particularly in the 3rd district, there are 37 properties which are coming up for renewal or expiration on their HUD contract, affecting thousands of families within the Philadelphia area. So as we see the sort of change of Philadelphia, as the Schuylkill Yards project proposes a transformation of West Philadelphia, we have this serious question around how do we protect low-income housing? How do we preserve the Black and brown communities and cultural contributions that built what we know Philadelphia to be today? And so the leadership of that community, in both standing in their fight and listening their demands, right? Which I'll certainly put into the chat. And many of us going to head to the encampment to live those demands while we're there, is about a stance for housing justice in the city altogether. And I think with that, you also saw, just as we talked about DECOLONIZE Museums as a transnational effort, there's ongoing conversations with, Moms for Housing out of Oakland, right, who also took a stance for the displacement that was happening in Oakland. And we know this expands, like, if you go there now, in Spiral Q, one of our amazing arts and cultural organizations, you'll see the shirts from West Philly to West Bank, right? So they're also making a connection with the displacement and settler colonialism in Palestine. So you're seeing this transnational connection being made, and the people's townhomes is the one stance that the residents are really leading and pushing forward on an agenda for that. So I hope that you see my folks, to really stand on it. And yeah, I hope many folks learn about it. I'll certainly put more of that in the chat as well.
Can I add to that?
Oh yeah.
One, how can people contribute to UC Townhomes?
Real quick. To people's townhomes.
People can contribute to the People's Townhomes by going to savetheuctownhomes.com. That is the website where you'll both see the demands, fully written out, and an update on any events and organizing that's been happening. There's opportunities there to see what the supports the encampments need. Today, it was announced Sharpies would be good for arts activities, soccer ball for sports, ice, right? You know how hot it is today,
Yeah.
right? And then there's ongoing ways that anybody who works here in arts and culture can, lead activities there with the residents and the families that are there. There's opportunities to do teach-ins. We just had an amazing one led by Drake Rodriguez about Black spatial politics. So there's also opportunities for that. Maybe we can do like a decolonized museum exhibit or something like that. We can figure something out. So those opportunities are there. Gigi?
And I just want to add that another thing is that since it is an encampment, we're there.
Hi, I'm Gigi. I'm a part of Police Guggenheim and have been involved with organizing the Coalition to Save UC Townhomes. And I want to say that one of the big things we've been doing is like holding space. We're there all day, every night. And we really would love for community members to come, sign a petition, meet the residents, meet the folks leading this, and just like be in community. Like one of the best parts is me, my brother, my friend, like we just are there, meeting folks, building those relationships, and like remembering that there is joy in the organizing and protest too. Like it's not just we're trying to save housing in Philly, it's like we're also having those beautiful moments. So hopefully y'all can come tonight and be coming because we'll be there. We ain't going nowhere.
I just wanted to add.
Oh yes, and the petition is also there. You can sign it. You can also sign it on the line. So I'm gonna go check in on something real quick.
Okay, I know we want to transition to Q&A. I just want to add that my grandmother lived in the bottom of West Philly on Viola Street for a long time, and before Viola Street, she was one of the first residents of the West Park Apartments of 46th Street. So deep connection to West Philly, and seeing 40th Street transform over the past decade, like a few decades, has been just really like disruptive to like cultural memory for me, right? Of how I remember places, which is by landmarks, not necessarily intersections, right? Or like that building used to be there, or that pet shop was right next to the oil place that I used to go to on 40th and near 40th and Market. But what I want to say is that a few years ago, the Black and Brown Workers Co-op, we started a displacement campaign, anti-displacement campaign called Disappearing Blackness is Displacement Politics, because I think it's important to name how when Black people start to disappear in neighborhoods, that it is always linked to displacement politics, right? And how that happens in West Philly is jarring to see and watch. And that, I just wish that more people knew about what was happening at people's townhomes and understood it as connected to their struggle, because housing is it, y'all. Housing is connected to climate, the climate crisis, and these land grabs that we're seeing absolutely have to be talked about in the ways that even Black politicians in this city align with developers around pushing us out, right? And so that's why we focused on councilperson prerogative, which is this idea that in the district councils seats, those council people ultimately are the major deciders in how land is sold and used, public land, and we have to continue to put pressure on these folks to show up for people's townhomes and other folks being displaced and uprooted from their communities.
Yeah, and I think this kind of adds to our conversation on reparations as well, thinking about housing and land back initiatives as well all need to be part of that conversation. So thank you for telling us about this BUC townhomes.
I'm going to try to do about 8 minutes for questions, try to hold around 6:50. So I do have some online as well, but does anyone in the room also have questions? And is Khalil in the building? From the People's Media Record? I would also really love for you to give a quick opening about your project, because I think it's really important and has a deep connection here. So would you be willing to speak about it for a second? Okay, good. All right, so I got one. Phil, you got a question? Yeah. Okay, so I got one person online, then I'm gonna come to you, Phil, and then I'm coming to you, Khalil. All right. So Sabi, I'm coming to you, but I'll mute you for a second.
Can you hear me? Okay. So I saw that somebody was actually addressing the question while I was writing it.
Okay.
And someone on the panel. And so I was talking about the fact that a few years ago, I attended a presentation at the University of Penn Museum on the Indigenous American artifacts. And in fact, Malkia, I think I remember you being there. In that presentation, you were a student. And so that's when I first realized when I asked the question about how many artifacts had actually been repatriated to the Indigenous Americans. And then we got this doublespeak about, well, there are tribal disputes and we can't get involved in the tribal disputes. So when there's a dispute, we hold on to the artifact until the dispute is settled. And so this is, I found, was the escape route. And in everything, in all the documents and committee meetings and outcomes and things like that, and papers that were presented as solutions, that history tells us that we always have to look for the escape route, because no matter how good it looks on the surface, somewhere in there is written an escape route for how they're going to get out of keeping their word. And this is definitely applying to the repatriation of all the artifacts to the people to whom they belong throughout the Americas and throughout Africa and the other places in the world. And so we have to look for the escape route all the time, because it will be there and we need to see it up front. So we're not wasting time being hoodwinked about good intentions that have no intention of being kept.
Thank you so much, Asabi. I don't know if anyone wants to respond to that.
Oh yeah. For that question or comment, I'll just speak briefly about the Morton collection at the museum. Part of the issue and part of the continuing of the violence is not having clear catalogs. So we know from Morton's own documentation what was in his collection at the time of his death. And then his collection was bought by Wistar, and Wistar added crania to that collection posthumously. So we know only we know only what was in the original catalog, right? Penn has not disclosed what still remains from that original catalog. Some of the repatriation is tracked on their website. Some of it is not. Some of it is unclear. So we actually don't have an idea of the inventory, right, we have to understand what they have first in order to talk about how to care and return what they have. And so part of it is Penn not disclosing and not putting on the books publicly. You know, they want to publicly digitize certain, you know, crania, but they don't want to tell us exactly what's in their inventory, in their quote-unquote accession or official collections. And then we have no clue what they have in unofficial collections. And that's where you see the violence of holding Patricia and Delicia's remains, right? That was a private collection of a curator that wasn't an official collection. And so I think part of what I want to see happen is some kind of, I don't know if it's legal, some kind of pressure to disclose exactly what they have to the community so that we know what to do with that information.
Yeah, I like what you say about escape valves, and there's so many different ways that institutions kind of wriggle out of these conversations. A lot of times they say, oh, we have proof of purchase for various items, or you know, the whatever place source of origin doesn't have the resources to take care of or preserve these objects. So there's a whole list of excuses. And I think the issue of transparency is really key that you bring up, Abdulali. Oftentimes, even at the American Museum of Natural History in New York, they have repatriated objects through NAGPRA, and yet these objects will sort of just disappear off of museum shelves with no explanation of why, of what was there in the first place. So really, audiences, visitors don't even know about these repatriation processes and that they are actually taking place. So I think that sort of truth-telling needs to be an important part of this.
I just have one little note. The one thing I'll add to that I think is worth mentioning is the boards of these museums and have so much control over what the curators do, over what people who manage the collections do. And one issue with inventory, with NAGPRA, is that it's the bottom of their priority in terms of how they're moving resources. So they'll have one underpaid researcher sort of maybe like a couple times a month trying to, scramble notes and details of objects that should be repatriated. And then they'll be fundraising millions of dollars to renovate other exhibits, to, show stolen objects in prettier cases. So I think, and also usually the members of these boards are of themselves violent people. We look at the Met, for example, and Big Pharma and things like that. So I think it's worthwhile looking at each level of who's responsible for why these things are taking as long as they are and advocating for better priorities. I think if there's any, reform thing, it's making sure that the priorities are straight in terms of getting people their stuff back.
So we have one question from Phil. I'm gonna allow y'all to sort of marinate on that question and kind of weave it into your final comments. And then I also want to take space to talk about the People's Media Record, because I think the project that they are doing bears a strong relationship to our discussion today. So Phil, your question, Chris?
Yes, my question is, if you look at what's going on in our communities, like for instance with the UC Townhomes project, unfortunately, it seems like it's a reaction to when there should have been proaction. So, what do you think needs to be done in our communities as a whole to help our people become more proactive so we don't be reactive?
That's a major final question, Ben. But I want to give space to talk about the People's Media Record for a second.
Thank you, Chris. My name is Kalila, and my name is Kalila, and I I work with the People's Media Record, which is a community-based archive initiative, and we just recently have been developing a needs assessment project where we've been assessing a community-oriented, community-based audiovisual collections in the city of Philly. And the Paul Robinson House is part of that initiative. They responded to our survey, and we're really happy that you participated because this project and other organizations like Spiral Q have also been part of this initiative where we're trying to see how we can build bridges between similar community-oriented archives that represent minoritized groups, historically oppressed groups, beyond the institutional structures that we need to break down, tear down, as I think that's actually, you don't need a, I think that's the best way to actually describe it without, using academic speak, right? So, I am just inspired by that. And yeah, I just wanted to share this with you all. And so we're going to continue with a needs assessment plan that is geared towards building resources for organizations like the Paul Robinson House and how we can work together different community-based archives in the city of Philadelphia to not just react but also act against the powers that be.
Thank you so much, Kalila. And I'll give my one to peoplesmediarecord.com, peoplesmediarecord.com. They have a section for the Philadelphia Student Union, which features rallies and talks and mobilizations that go back all the way to the early 2000s that were captured in video and audio. And I'm like, what does this mean for our movements? It's such a powerful thing. So with that being said, I'm coming back to Phil's question. It's what's next? What can we do to be more proactive as we close out today? Thank you so much.
I was laughing at it when you were saying, but you have a great radio voice. To your question, thank you for that question. I think I always think about what oppressed people go through daily and how the systems are structured for us to not have conversations and not convene in the ways that we want to and need to respond to the violence. And so I think the answer is what they're doing at the People's Townhomes, is to organize in the place that the struggle is happening, to have those people in those townhomes lead the struggle, lead the public conversation, and support them. And I think in terms of organizing, that's how you should always organize, right? Amplify and support the folks who have been having these conversations. Because I think part of the issue is, when we're in our own kind of communities, in our community pockets, we assume that conversations are happening, or we name it as, oh, this isn't happening, because we may not know what other people are doing. But people have been having conversations about displacement. Like Chris said, for example, let's talk about the legacy of MOVE. John Africa was an organizer around anti-displacement that before he became the leader of MOVE. So the conversation of Powhatan Village and of the Black Bottom being disrupted and Black people being pushed out has been a conversation, and organizing has been happening, at least we know, since the 70s, probably even prior to that, right? And so these things happen, and I think to talk about how systems target folks, right, who do this kind of organizing work, that's my response, right? The reason why it seems like Black folks are being reactionary and not proactive, as you said, a lot of that has to do with how people are systematically targeted for the organizing work they do. For example, when I organized around councilperson prerogative, I was arrested and said that I tried to stab a cop, right? And they gave me trumped up charges, and that was meant to fuck with with my mental health, right? The way that Aunt Smith was targeted during the uprising was meant to specifically disrupt organizing work. And I think the response to that is having more community care, right? More like literal care for folks who do that kind of work on the front lines, because it does change you in your relationship sometimes to people that you love. And so having people in community with you to help support you through it is the way I think that we get to a place where more people want to organize or can have capacity if they want to.
For me, I think if decolonization is possible, it lies in that question. And I think in the work we've been doing here on community archiving and thinking what is the ultimate goal and why are we doing this, it's for relationship building. It's for bringing people together who are around here, who are part of the history of this house, the history of this neighborhood. And so I think in terms of being proactive, it's about relationship building, it's about knowing your neighbors, it's about being a community and actually knowing who you're going to be in struggle with. And I think cultural organizing is one way to bring that all together. And thinking about our memories, both through lineage, personal memory, collective memory, neighborhood memory, and thinking about ways that we can bond over that, or we can build on that together, or really take agency over our histories so we can build our futures, ultimately.
Well, that was just so beautifully said. I think just to apply that sort of framework to the conversation we're having on museums, I think there shouldn't be such a binary maybe between reactive and proactive. I think it's normal and healthy to be reactive when you're faced with so much trauma, much of which we spoke about today. Feeling anger and grief is normal and expected. And then that proactive aspect can exist at the same time. Whether you're reimagining what stewardship can look like in the future outside of the limitations of science as we know it, or if you're reconstructing digital art to rethink what repatriation or what museums might look like in the future. So I feel very honored to have this amazing conversation with both of you who are extremely proactive. And so I've learned a lot, and I just wanted to thank everyone for coming.
Everybody give it up for our panel one more time. Decolonize Museums should be out next month. We gonna also, supply chain stuff, how that stuff goes. And thank you all again. We're gonna, begin to close up here. We're preparing for like a mixer at the People's Townhomes around 7:45. Where everyone is, open and invited. It's the corner of 40th Market. You really can't miss it at 40th Market. I'll say that. And then, and feel free while you're indoors. We want people to be masked. You can go on the porch. We got water out there. We just like to relax and continue to just greet one another. And I appreciate our panel once again. Look forward to continue to work with you all, because I know we will. See y'all soon.